Just in time for the spooky season this week on the podcast, I am doing a novel that is an absolute masterpiece of the gothic genre. It is a twisting tale of a new relationship in wake of an old relationship. It is a beauty of a story, and it is none other than Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. Hello and welcome to the Literature Podcast, a novel review. My name is Seamus, your host, and together we will discuss, dissect, and explore the wonderful world of literature. And the wonderful world of literature is a vast and dense jungle. So let's start making our way through, one book at a time. Hey everyone, how are we going? Welcome back to another episode of a novel review, a book podcast. My name is Seamus, I am the host, and well, we do what it says on the tin. We explore a different book every week. As always, if there is a book that you would like me to do, please feel free to suggest it in the comments or send me an email or Instagram or whatever. I've been saying that for a few weeks now, and I've gotten some absolutely fantastic recommendations, which is great. But it sort of highlights I think the best and worst thing about a podcast is, or a book podcast, I should say, is that I think I've had probably 12 recommendations over the last 2-3 weeks, and if I did one book a week, that's 12 weeks, and that's 3 months worth of podcasting. So the best and worst thing about podcasting is there's always another good book to come, but you actually have to sit down and read that book, which can take some time. And also finding the book as well. I always try to find them secondhand first, because I think that's, it's a nicer thing to do than always just going straight to the big bookshop chains, or supporting an independent bookshop, but we're getting very much off topic here. So yes, welcome to the book podcast, a novel review. Every week, I like to start with a mantelpiece moment, just something to highlight from the week past, something to celebrate, and I've had a pretty good week, actually. I joined a writing club, which is super fun. It's really great to be around, I guess, other aspiring writers, and to just sort of do simple things, like just go to a cafe and read with them, or write with them, I should say, which was really nice. But I actually had a good week for another reason. 2 more recommendations. Let's start with this one, Rubble Children by Kreuter, 7.5 stories. This is a recommendation from my friend in Canada who works in publishing, and I pretty much just trust her blindly now with her recommendations, because they're always really great. And it looks like this really interesting 7.5 interlinked stories, and I genuinely have no idea really what it's about. It seems to be this kind of eclectic mix of short stories, or sort of short, longer stories that are all interlinked somehow, and is compiled into this book. And I did a class at university. It was called Literature and the Novel, and it was exploring what is a novel. And one of the debate questions for one of the weeks for one of the tutorials was, what constitutes a novel? Let's read the book, The History of the World in 11.5 chapters by Julian Barnes. And the premise for the question was, if you have a book that is comprised of 11.5 chapters, or in this case 7.5 chapters, and they're all interlinked stories, is it just a collection of short stories that are all linked, or is it a novel? Is there a definition or a separation there that we need to sort of define? I don't know. Let me know your thoughts. So yeah, that's sort of why I'm really keen to read that, because I was interested by that kind of entire class in general, but that entire that week, that sort of question of what actually defines a novel. So I'm keen to sort of kick that debate back off nearly 10 years post-university, which is a sad thing to say, but Rubble Children looks really good. And then the next one, I said that I had started reading Carrie by Stephen King, which was the first book he ever wrote, and a friend said, well, you absolutely have to read Misery. So I went and got it, couldn't find it secondhand, had to buy it brand new. Looks absolutely fantastic. Have never seen the film either, which I've told a few people, and it shocked a few people as well. And because it just looks like this incredible story. And now that I've kind of broken my Stephen King cherry, Carrie was my first read, I'm looking at the list of all these books here, and I mean, it's kind of for me like an untapped resource that I'm really looking forward to sinking my teeth quite heavily into now, because he's got a lot of stories here. I mean, The Shining was a fantastic film when I saw it. It's one of those films that you kind of watch and you're like, God, I can't wait to rewatch that. And then you don't rewatch it for years, and then suddenly it just pops up again on like a rainy Sunday, and it's like the perfect thing you just need at that exact moment. But I also had no idea he'd done the Dark Tower trilogy, this fantasy trilogy. Not a trilogy series, sorry, a series. It looks to be not a trilogy at all. It looks to almost be 10 books, which is incredible because he's just written so much, and there seems to be quite a lot of good stuff. He's kind of like a cult writer. He seems to have a real cult following. And yeah, I mean, Carrie was absolutely fantastic. I'm doing an episode on that next week, so stay tuned for that. But really looking forward to now jumping into Misery as well. I try not to do that too often, where I like find a good author and then jump straight back into them. But Misery just looks kind of fun, and Carrie was a lot of fun to listen to. And I want to read a Stephen King book. So there we go. Housekeeping, if you would like to like and subscribe, I would really appreciate it. If you're on YouTube, click the duck in the corner, something amazing happens. And yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, it's a free podcast, so don't be put off by that. Don't feel the need to, just sit back, and I hope you enjoy the show. Okay, on to the main body of the podcast. Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I read it on my Kindle. It was, I think, 99 cents, so you can't beat those Kindle daily deals. And I mean, if you're on YouTube, you can see it is the most uninspiring cover. I know we're not meant to judge a book by its cover, but this is a book I can honestly say I did judge by its cover for so many years, but I'll get into that soon. But this cover is just so uninspiring. If you're not listening to this on YouTube and can't see the cover, you're really not missing much. It's literally just the name, Rebecca, Daphne du Maurier, and a bunch of lines. So not that inspiring at all, but it is an absolutely fantastic book. Please, like me, do not be put off by the cover. It was absolutely incredible. I thoroughly recommend it. It was near perfect, I'm going to say that straight off the bat. So what is it about? Let's do a quick overview. Rebecca is about a young unnamed narrator. She's quite young. She's 24, I believe it was. So she's, in those days, practically ancient, 1 foot in the grave. So she's 24, I believe it is. Might have been 26, but still incredibly young by today's standards. Unmarried, and she meets the fabulously wealthy, recently widowed Maxim de Winter in Monte Carlo, I believe it was, in Monaco. They start a relationship, and they have, of course, after 2 weeks of courting each other, they get married. And she moves back to England to his fabulously large mansion, Manderley, which is down in Cornwall. And from there, the story just sort of becomes this really complex tale of the new Mrs. de Winter trying to survive in the shadows of the late Mrs. de Winter, this woman called Rebecca, who haunts the house. Haunts figuratively, I say, in inverted commas, because of course she is deceased, but it's just kind of the memory of her that permeates this story and haunts the new Mrs. de Winter. And that's what the story is about. It's kind of like this, how do you survive in a world as a new person coming into a relationship when the old person has died and the memory of them is still incredibly, incredibly fresh. And that's what the story is about. And it's this gothic story. It's this psychological suspense story. And it's absolutely thrilling. I genuinely loved it. So getting back to now, judging a book by its cover. I had to read for university Jamaica Inn by Daphne du Maurier, and I remember really liking it, but I can't remember anything of the story at all, which is probably just a sign that I need to go back and reread it. Please don't judge me for that, because when you're studying for my undergraduate, I did literature and ancient history, and doing 2 literature classes and 2 ancient history classes, there's often a lot of readings. Most literature classes want you to read a book a week. So if you're doing 2 literature classes, you're trying to read 2 novels a week. So sometimes there was a few frantic weeks where you just skimming a few pages of some great books, which is kind of like the sadness of it all. So I remember reading Jamaica Inn, thinking it was great, but obviously can't remember it at all. And then for years, Rebecca would always pop up, but it was always this really colourful cover. And it's not that I'm against just a classic sort of romance novel set in sort of like a period piece. It was just, I never felt in the mood for it. It's kind of like I thought it was going to be like a very Jane Austen kind of vibe, one of those just like a happy period piece, some sadness. Some sentimentality thrown in there, some absolute fabulous wealth in there, but I just sort of never wanted to jump into it. And then I actually don't know why I jumped into it now, but I did. And I was very, very mistaken, very happily mistaken, I should say, because the cover always seemed to be this really colourful, I don't want to say like frilly cover, but it seemed to be like this quite enjoyable cover of like everyone I saw was like beautiful writing and it had flowers on it and looked really, really frilly, I guess is probably a nice word for it. But it's actually this really intense psychological, I don't want to say horror story, but gothic story. It's really moody and ominous and atmospheric, and it is just not at all what I was expecting. So it's a lesson to me, don't judge a book by its cover. If someone says it's a good book, chances are it's probably a good book. So I read it, I loved it. Like I said, it's an unnamed narrator, and I think that's just such a masterful stroke of genius by Daphne du Maurier. She's obviously an accomplished writer, and there's a reason for that. And the whole point, and I didn't initially pick up on it, but the narrator being unnamed, this young woman being unnamed, you lose a lot of sort of your identity through that. And I know we're sort of told, at least I've been told a few times, you shouldn't judge someone on their name because like their name is just sort of given to them. But I think you do sort of not judge someone by their name, but that's sort of like the foundation of how you characterize someone, because that's sort of like their name, that's the umbrella, and then in there you sort of start to, they're this high, they're this, they're that. You start to attach these characteristics to the name to build out sort of the persona of who this person is. And because you never get the name, you never really get to attach yourself to this character in a way that you really, really know them. But what it also does is, once this character actually marries Maxim, the main male in this story, she then becomes Mrs. De Winter. And through that, she sort of loses all identity because, of course, Rebecca was Mrs. De Winter. And so you've got now two Mrs. De Winters, and you see how she's just sort of stepped into this shadow of the former Mrs. De Winter, this Rebecca that is haunting the entire story. So it was an absolutely, I think, genius masterstroke of a move to just leave, very easy thing to do, to just leave out the main character's name, because it just added this really, this atmospheric tone to the entire novel that sort of stripped you of all identity in this story, because she's like a working class girl before she meets Maximum. She's a helper for an American woman. She's incredibly working class. She's quite introverted. And then she meets Maximum De Winter, who is fabulously wealthy and, owns this large property in England. And when she goes back there, she's sort of introduced to this life as a I want to say master in inverted commas, but she's sort of, she's the lady of the house. She's got helpers helping her. She's got cooks cooking for her. She's got people that are giving her, she's got house ladies, all these things. And suddenly she's in charge of all these things that she used to be. And she doesn't quite know how to survive in this world. And also we never know her name. So she's kind of stripped of any identity she had before the house is just kind of lost. And she just becomes the lady of the house, Mrs. De Winter. And through this, we get this really, I think it's a really interesting sense. And a few people say it starts off kind of slow, but I think it's a really interesting sense of what it is to be someone stepping into a world when you're sort of like completely fresh to it. In one sense, it's like stepping into a new relationship and like there's an entire sort of ecosystem already surviving, and you're stepping into the shoes of someone that everyone else before liked. You've broken up with your boyfriend or girlfriend and your family really liked him, and then you get a new boyfriend or girlfriend, and then it's kind of like you're just naturally comparing yourself to them in a way. And that's what she does a lot. She's in her own head, this new Mrs. De Winter. I almost wish she had a name because it would be much easier to distinguish when talking about it. But for a lot of the novel, she's comparing herself to the former Mrs. De Winter, to Rebecca, because she's wondering how she's doing, how she's surviving. And it's this really slow build of tension through the story because Rebecca's soul is just dominating this house. Like, Rebecca is, married to Maximum for many years, so that this house has actually been created and curated by Rebecca, so that when the new Mrs. De Winter comes in, everything has its place and everyone knows what's going on. All the housekeepers are sort of like this well-oiled machine under Rebecca's tutelage. And so when the new person comes in, this new Mrs. De Winter, it's kind of like this real kind of sticky situation where we don't know how she's going to fit in and she doesn't know how she's going to fit in. And so it builds this sort of natural tension that's not even kind of like the gothic aspect of this book, because that's just kind of like a natural tension that would arise from a situation like that. But then, of course, there's this entire gothic aspect of the novel that is just, you don't know what's going on. It's sort of like blood-curdling kind of stuff, and not in like a horror kind of way, but it's just building with this ruthless tension, and you don't know where it's actually going, but you know something's happening. And that kind of brings me to the house lady, Mrs. Danvers. because she is this, on the surface, she's fantastic at her job. The house runs, perfectly. It's very much a well-oiled machine. But she comes into this story as this housemaid that is very much devoted to Rebecca, and so therefore hates the new Mrs. De Winter. And I think she is just a perfect villain for this story. She's a perfect villain in general because she technically doesn't do anything wrong, but she tortures the new Mrs. De Winter. So the new Mrs. De Winter is incredibly, she's quite singular, she's incredibly introverted, and she's quite shy because of this, and she doesn't quite know how to operate in this world as someone in now a position of power. And Mrs. Danvers really picks up on this quite quickly. And there's sort of one particular scene where every morning, it's kind of like a funny thing. I didn't even imagine this was a thing, but every morning the new Mrs. De Winter comes down and she has to read over the menu for the day and decide, yes, I'll have this, happily have the cooks make this for me today. And it sounds absolutely fabulous to just walk downstairs and someone's given you a menu of what food you're going to be served for the day. And of course, if you don't like it, you can change it. And the new Mrs. De Winter is confused by this. She's like, why, what is this? And Mrs. Danvers is like, well, this is your menu for the day. This is how you do it. This is what Rebecca did. And she starts talking about Rebecca in this really kind of like lavish and embellished kind of way that it starts to irk the new Mrs. De Winter a lot. But she doesn't know what to do about it because she also recognizes that nothing's really being done wrong. This Mrs. Danvers is just talking about Rebecca, which is also quite a natural thing to do. But over time, throughout the novel, Mrs. Danvers keeps repeatedly bringing up Rebecca in a way that's quite embellishing of Rebecca and her memory, and it's also sort of scorning the new Mrs. De Winter and taunting her as well. And so Mrs. Danvers becomes this perfect villain because she keeps bringing up Rebecca, this memory of Rebecca, this soul of Rebecca that permeates the house in this really kind of nasty way that tortures the new Mrs. De Winter. And I absolutely love those scenes because they're really frustrating to read. And I just think it's like the perfect villain of doing nothing wrong, doing nothing technically wrong. She's allowed to talk about Rebecca, but she knows what she's doing. She knows the pain she's causing on the new Mrs. De Winter. She knows the hurt and the anger and the angst that she's stirring up by constantly bringing up Rebecca. And I thought it was just absolutely sickeningly wonderful. Another thing I will say about this book is it's incredibly readable. I know you sort of like look at a book from this time period or a previous time period, and you might pick up a Jane Austen novel and think, oh, I've kind of got to be in the mood for this because sometimes the language is that little bit dense that I'm not going to pick it up and start it at 9 p.m. on a Sunday night when it's, I only want to read for half an hour and go to bed. They can be kind of dense at a certain time in a way that it can be not difficult to pick up and read, but it can be like, I've got to be in the mood to continue reading this kind of story. It reads so incredibly well. It's incredibly accessible. The language is simply beautiful. There are a few words that pop up here and then that are sort of repeated a lot, but that's okay. But the writing is just so, it's so accessible. Like it's such a readable book and it's like a real big page turner, but it's also like a really nice writing style. And the story, like I said, builds with this tension that is just accentuated by the language. And I'm really struggling to talk about this book without revealing some of the twists and turns. And there's like a huge, sort of twist in this book that absolutely caught me by surprise. I had no idea it was coming. I was like so happily reading this book, like with this building tension, not understanding where the tension was actually building to. And then this complete turn just happens, and like I was shocked. I was genuinely shocked because it just came out of nowhere and I hadn't expected it at all, and it was absolutely fantastic. I mean, it's so good when they come off, isn't it? When a complete surprise happens in a book like this and you're just like, I did not expect that at all. So I think I'm going to have to stop talking about it there. I think I've sung its praises enough. It's absolutely worth a read. I absolutely love this book and I would absolutely recommend it to anyone. Gothic story, just in time for the spooky season, like I said. Incredibly readable. I think it was about 350 pages, so not too long, but obviously not too short. I think the opening, it opens the first few chapters are a bit slow as it starts to get going, but like I said, it's just nicely building it, and that very quickly turns into this wonderful, beautiful story. So I would absolutely recommend it. I'm going to rate this a 4.6 out of 5. So what was I reading this week? This week I was reading Octavia E. Butler's book, Kindred, and it is absolutely wild. This was a recommendation from a listener in case you were thinking, oh, if I recommend a book, he's never going to read it. No, I will absolutely try to read it. It's a fantastic book. It's about a black woman in 1976 who, through time travel, goes back to 1815 on a few different occasions, and she's assumed a slave. And I mean, it's this really curious story about how do you sort of transition from this period of being in 1976 to then go back to 1815. You've obviously got rights and freedom in 1976 as a black woman, and you go back to 1815 and suddenly you're a slave and you are despised. And it's this really interesting story. There's a lot of humanity in it. There's a lot of searching for humanity as well and trying to find the humanity in people in, the previous time period, 1815, when there was slavery and white people were doing some absolutely terrible things. So there's a lot of, I think, frightening scenes in here and a lot of tough read, a lot of scenes that are quite tough to read for that reason. But I think there's a lot of hope and the search for humanity in this book is quite strong. So I'm absolutely loving it. I don't think it's going to explain why the time travel happens, and that's completely fine because it's not like a major part of the story. It's more about the story within the story itself. So Kindred by Octavia E. Butler. Halfway through or just over halfway through and absolutely loving it. So would recommend at this stage. Absolutely. If you would like to like and subscribe, I would really, really appreciate it. Please feel free to head along to the website and support the pod in other ways. But always just thank you for coming this far, and thank you for your attention. So today, to take us away, I've got a very interesting quote that I don't quite understand. It's from the first book in a fantasy series that I'm going to start reading soon, by Mervyn Peake, called Titus Groan. And yeah, I mean, this book was recommended to me as well, but I picked up and read this quote and thought that is really, really weird and curious. I kind of like the sound of it. So here we go. Dost thou love picking meat? Or wouldst thou see a man in the clouds and have him speak to thee?